בוקר טוב.
Good morning. We are very happy to have the former Defense Minister, Knesset member Avigdor Liberman here this morning. I'd like to save time, and of course there's really no need to introduce him. He's so well known and has contributed so much to changes and potential changes in the future, and it's important to hear from him directly what he thinks is going to happen. He will be interviewed by the very senior political diplomatic commentator from Yediot, Ahronoth, Shimon, Shiffer, and this will create an interesting event. MK Liberman, Shimon, Shiffer, the floor is yours. I wanted to seat you on my right, but I don't get to choose, so now you're on my left. I'll do my best. Good morning, everyone. There are different ways of holding an interview, certainly with a public figure and a politician who has such long mileage. There is the idea of radio method, which is to pull out of the archive everything he said in the past 40 years and put it before him, and then the first question would be the 48 hours of Hania. And I'm going to choose a different path when I interview people, usually, not just now. I learned this from ourselves. Imagine that if a journalist were presented with everything he had ever written, what would happen to them? So good morning to you. Our interviewee this morning, as you see, made the amendment that was required in wake of the efforts of Benjamin Netanyahu to change the program according to which democracy is built in Israel. After failing to establish a government, forced Israelis to go to the polls a second time within just months from the elections for the 21st Knesset. And all this happened because our guest, Avigdor Liberman, refused to be part of a government which would have turned Israel, as he said, into a halachic state, a theocracy. The coming elections remind us of something we find in our sources, tikkun olam, fixing the world. Lieberman reminds me of the boy with his finger in the dike. Netanyahu was the first to see that Lieberman might be the one to push him out of Balfour, the Prime Minister's residence, placing us in the situation in which we are. And Lieberman was the head of the initiative that placed made Netanyahu Prime Minister, and then he served as Foreign Minister, Minister of Defense, Energy, Transportation, and also Chair of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. And before I start with the questions, I'd like to say something about his family. He's married to Alla. They have 3 children, Michal, Kobi, and Amos. In their private lives, they provide an example of what he calls live and let live. Part of the family, Mrs. Lieberman and Michal, lead a religious lifestyle, and as Avigdor often tells me, he and his 2 sons occasionally eat kosher too. What we have been seeing in the past 24 hours, alongside the Haredi parties who have declared war on him because he refused to live in a theocracy, that war has been joined by the new Minister of Transportation, Mr. Smotrich, who also attacked Lieberman wildly. Mr. Lieberman, what's happening with your national partners? Why is Smotrich attacking you? First of all, thank you. I would like to comment both regarding the aims of my party. There is no goal for my party, Yisrael Beiteinu, to remove Netanyahu. I would adopt Donald Trump's slogan and change it, make Israel normal again. That is the only goal. Regarding our friend Smotrich, what is happening with religious Zionism is a Greek tragedy. When I look back, at Zvulun Hammer and Yitzchak Levy, I made quite a few agreements with them between the historical National Religious Party and the Beiteinu and the National Union Party. They have nothing in common. This is a takeover by a small group of extremist zealots, and also to a large extent hypocrites. They are taking over all of religious Zionism. I hope that ultimately this will end and we will once again see something that is more like the historical National Religious Party. And if I've already touched on this, there is an amazing phenomenon that concerns me a lot, and I'm talking about the pre-military academies, the religious ones, and I say that some of the people that built this system in 1997 with Zvulun Hammer and with Yitzchak Mordechai, who was the Minister of Defense, and Yahya in 1997, we arranged the whole matter of these pre-military academies, and I'm going to say a few very difficult things about this, but we must not throw out the baby with the bathwater. The religious pre-military academies have trained and prepared some of the finest combat soldiers we have, and I hope they continue to be active. As Yitzchak Shamir says, it's a good idea to start with but. Yes, but what is happening today, the story of the religious pre-military academies, it is developing in the direction of private religious militias, phalanges. As the Minister of Defense and with the students in the pre-military academies, when I ask them, if you get an order from your military commander and your rabbi says just the opposite, what will you do? And I have to say that it took them 30, 40 seconds to figure out the answer. The vast majority, I admit, said, I will of course follow my commander's orders. But some said explicitly, I will follow the instructions of my rabbi. I will not disobey my rabbi. When I look at this amazing thing, that here there are soldiers who are subordinate not to their direct military commander, But to a spiritual leader or a rabbi, that is dangerous. That can't be. When you look and see who these rabbis are, if I take a pre-military academy, which is perhaps the flagship of the pre-military academies, the religious ones, and I take two of the rabbis of Eli, Rabbi Yisrael Beiteinu, who as the Minister of Defense I had to suspend, when he tells his students in the pre-military academy about women's service in the army, so what if there is a woman commander of commanding? They've driven our girls crazy. They go in Jewish and they won't be Jewish on the other end. That's an amazing thing to say. I'd like to remind you that when the Nachal Brigade was established, Bnei Akiva was part of it. In August of 1948, the youth movements, when they decided to establish the Nachal Brigade, there was correspondence with Ben-Gurion. Bnei Akiva was part of it. But the other rabbi, the other head of the pre-military academy, and the fact that he still holds a senior position in this pre-military academy, and I am talking about Rabbi Giora Redler, that is moral and value bankruptcy on the part of the government. Let me give you a short quote. It's a long quote, so I'll just try. I extracted a few pearls of wisdom. Let's start from the question if Hitler was right or not. He was absolutely right, because he was right in everything he said. In his ideology is 100% correct, besides the fact that he was on the wrong side. Even if, when you recall this lecture, which was on the eve of the Holocaust, and I heard afterwards all kinds of explanations from that rabbi that it was taken out of context and so on. That can't be. There's no context to what he said. The fact that he is still holding his job, that's a disgrace and bankruptcy both of religious Zionism and of the government of Israel. If you ask me what should be done, and we will demand in the next government that this be done, is to disconnect the Ministry of Education from the pre-military academies. This dual nature, this dual loyalty of the pre-military academies to the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Defense, that's impossible. The pre-military academies must be on the axis between the Ministry of Defense and the IDF. The Ministry of Education, which has become much more extremely religious, and even more so now that Rabbi Peretz is the Minister of Education, and he's also the head of a pre-military academy, and also Smutrich, who's coming from the other end. And we need to disconnect the pre-military academies and the ministry. When you talk about militias, I'm talking here, we've seen a process here that is developing in the direction of private militias. When you look at the other phenomena, when combat soldiers refuse to look at women soldiers singing on the stage, when soldiers are punished for, by mistake, putting salami and cheese together in the same refrigerator, or a soldier who took food from home and didn't realize there was meat inside, and he's punished for that. When you talk about kosher in the army, what is the different types of... There's one kosher certification. Everyone who serves in the money, there is the kosher certification of the military rabbinate, no other. And when you look at the totality, when you look at those rabbis, when you look at those spiritual leaders who are educating them with those philosophies, and I've given you just the tip of the iceberg, it cannot continue. Your political conclusion, I'm sure, and everyone who hears you would be that the next government, if you are part of it, will have to be made up differently, will have a different makeup. Who will be part of that government? Will the National Union, it's the Union of Right-Wing Parties, that's what it's called now. I don't know what they'll be called in the future. Who are the partners that will be part of the next government? Look, we have said on more than 100 times in the past month, we believe in a broad government approach. The state of Israel is at a critical juncture, far more so than people realize, both in terms of defense and in terms of the economy. We've all heard about the deficit. No one knows exactly how big that deficit is. We've all heard that yesterday the Iranians crossed the 300-kilogram line, what they're allowed to have of enriched uranium, according to the agreement. And we see what's happening in Syria, in Lebanon, in Gaza. In order to contend with all these challenges, at the same time, we need a broad government. I'm talking about a government made up of Yisrael Beiteinu, Likud, and Blue and White. Under no circumstances will we agree at this point either to the ultra-Orthodox parties or the National Religious Party, the Union of religious Zionist parties. There's something else that's disturbing. In August of 2018, a law of national civil service was passed, which should unite all the parts of the population to contribute, if not in military service, at least in national civil service. And the law was formulated so that there would be no sanctions if they don't meet the targets, so nobody plans to meet those targets. But beyond that, this has turned the Jewish Home or the Union of Right-Wing Parties, and this whole framework moves from one ministry to another. One day it's in the Ministry of Science, now they're in the Ministry of Agriculture. And this group of extreme religious right-wingers, instead of encouraging service on the part of the non-Jewish population, all they care about are the religious girls. They don't care about anything else. They don't meet the goals. They've neglected two important groups in the population, and they're carrying on. This whole story of national civil service has become a branch of the party. And when we're talking about relations between religion and state, I say we have to separate religion from politics. You can't separate religion and state in Israel, but you must separate religion and politics. You look at all the religious councils. They've all become party chapters of either Shas or the other ultra-Orthodox parties, and sometimes of the right-wing parties. But forgive me, ultimately you won't be able to... You're not telling us who your candidate for prime minister is. I don't think that's the right question. Why not? Ultimately, according to the way the law works in Israel, a coalition is usually made up of representatives of the largest parties. Who will be your candidate for prime minister? Because we have a coalition in Israel, there's no direct election of the prime minister. The question is more important of what the government is, not who the prime minister is. And I've told you that which three parties should make up the next government, and they have to formulate the guidelines and the platforms and so on, and based on those basic lines, and those who wish to join on that basis are welcome to join. And the party that has the largest number of Knesset seats will present their candidate for foreign minister. We don't rule out anyone. Our goal here is to make Israel normal again, and we want a normal state. We want a broad government that represents the mainstream of Israel. So if I've understood what you're saying, you do not rule out Benjamin Netanyahu as the next prime minister. I'm not ruling out anyone. Our condition before we recommend anyone to the president will be to agree to a broad government. If he doesn't agree, we won't recommend anyone. And what I see is wild competition between Benny Gantz and Netanyahu, who is sucking up more to the ultra-Orthodox parties. And they're giving them a blank check to sign at the bottom. And they've been in the government too long. With the extremism, it's not only the draft law. I look at everything that's happening, the grocery stores on Shabbat, the works on the bridge in Tel Aviv, the boycott of the Phoenicia Glass Company. We're seeing greater radicalization among the ultra-Orthodox too, and they need to cool off a bit, so it won't hurt a party to be in the opposition once. When they get used to being in the coalition, it's harmful. It's harmful both for the party and for the state. The place where we are sitting has been discussing security, diplomatic, political issues. If I were to sum up, Israel is facing three challenges or threats. The Iranian threat, Hezbollah, and Hamas. Are you willing to define or explain to us where you stand right now regarding Gaza and the solution which you consider an acceptable solution for the citizens of Israel? I don't quite agree with the three threats. There's no Iran and Hezbollah. Iran and Hezbollah are one and the same. We're talking about the Shiite revolution, which includes the whole Middle East, and Israel is its main target. You know, like all revolutionaries, unconnected to the actual revolution itself, they constantly want to increase and export the revolution. As Trotsky said, the permanent revolution, it doesn't matter if you're talking about Trotsky, Che Guevara, or Khomeini, they're always wanting to export the revolution, this ideologic, this radical ideology of hatred to Israel, of controlling the sources of energy, oil and gas together. This is a strategic threat. I see that we're talking about Iran, and I see a desire on the part of the Prime Minister to turn that into part of his political campaign. I would like to caution against that. This is indeed the classic case where you need to talk less and do more. I am certain, clearly, the Prime Minister is the best spokesperson in the world on the Iranian subject. I am doubtful whether he is capable of doing what needs to be done in practical terms. And an example of that is, of course, the Gaza Strip. And you talked about the 48 hours. I think that even in retrospect, I say that this is what we need to do. This is what we should have done. Unfortunately, the Prime Minister prevented any attack initiative on Hamas. He prefers to keep things quiet at all cost. We have learned that silence is dangerous, and the government of Israel is paying protection money to an organization, to a terror organization, and Hamas and Hezbollah have become a strategic threat because of that in terms of Israel's deterrent capabilities. And when you look at what's happening in the Gaza periphery area, families have to leave, more children need psychological therapy, and we're pretending as if nothing is happening. And it's amazing when the Qatari money is not going to the needy in Gaza. It's going to pay for Hamas's rearming, and we are enabling them, and Israel is providing raw materials for the manufacture of missiles. Sitting here is someone who was the coordinator of the government activities in the territories, Kogat, and he would never allow the entry of these chemicals and dual-use substances that can be used for the manufacture of rockets. And according to the worst-case assessment, Hamas has missiles that can reach as north as Hadera, the power station, to say nothing of Ben Gurion Airport. And Hamas has proved to all the Palestinians that the way to deal with Israel is through violence. And when I talk about a real threat after the Shiite revolution, Hamas is indeed represents the end of cooperation between the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority in Fatahland. The PA no longer exists. There are two separate entities. There's Hamastan in Gaza, Fatahland in Judea and Samaria, and if elections were held today in Judea and Samaria, Hamas would win big time. Hamas has managed to convince most of the Palestinians that the way to deal with Israel is through terror. And the deterioration in Judea and Samaria is far more dangerous than in Gaza. Why? 400,000 Jews travel those roads in Judea and Samaria every day, and that's a difficult problem. Because this has been defined as a personal interview, could you tell me, you hear that you are called the Russian by Netanyahu's associates, and on television you are called the guy with the Russian accent. Does that still offend you? I'm not offended. My Russian accent is something that will be mine forever, as far as I know. I'm proud of my Russian accent. We are the ingathering of the exiles here in Israel. And, you know, I have pity on all those people. The state of Israel is a melting pot, and we must concern ourselves with the future of this melting pot and talk about unity and not fragment into different groups. When you look at the ultra-Orthodox, you see them insulating themselves, isolating themselves, separate education paid by the government of Israel, by those people who work and pay taxes. They have separate neighborhoods, separate cities even. And we should speak out against these efforts to insulate themselves, to be as different as possible. We must go back to the melting pot concept. And when I talk about the pre-military academies, we must bear in mind that Ben Gurion, when he defined what the purpose of the IDF was, he wrote some amazing things. Back in 1949, in the order of the day to Yaakov Dori, the chief of staff, he wrote the first purpose of the IDF is the security of the state. That is its main role, but it must always serve as a pioneering educator for the youth of the country. The IDF is in the heart of every new soldier, love of the land, the ingathering of the exiles, the settlement and construction of the land, mutual aid and brotherhood, and the values of freedom and justice and peace in accordance with the vision of the prophets of Israel. I think that role of the IDF must be renewed and strengthened. Mr. Liberman, thank you. You look very well prepared for this interview.